Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to come today to join us. So I guess today is just a really, it's a discussion that I wanted to have with managers. So please feel free throughout what we're doing today for an hour and a half, just stop me and ask specific questions. This is a really good opportunity for you to unpack some issues that you've been thinking about, issues that you've been concerned about, or wanting some more strategies. So I'm going to begin. I'm going to share my screen. Please let me know that this is working. Good?
Good job, Ali.
Right, look at me. This is the first time I've done this. So this is the topic. This is the topic we're looking at everyone's AOD support needs. There's many groups that we all look after in our services, but today I'll be focusing on one group, of course. So, okay, that's not moving. I'll have to stop sharing and go back, sorry.
And just while Ali's doing that, I will say that this is designed to be quite an interactive session. So when we do come into group discussion, feel free to take off mute because it's fun, more natural, and as always a much richer discussion when people aren't having to put their hand up first to speak or unmute themselves. So feel free to do that.
And I guess for me, it's the first time I'm doing online training or a discussion like this. Usually when I train, I'm walking around a room a lot. So unfortunately, I won't be able to do that and actually meet you and interact with you. So I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the stolen land on which we all live and work. And also making a point that all, out of all poor health outcomes, there are no communities in Australia that have, that hold the greatest burden in that. But what we're going to be talking about today also touches on issues around racism and how they impact individuals in our services, and thinking about that on a sort of institutional, organisational level. So I'd just like to give a quick intro. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Ali Coelho. You can contact details from Naomi, and I'm a co-manager of the Centre for Culture, Ethnicity and Health, and we've been running for about 25 years. We assist services, we provide training, we've got resources in first language, but we are a part of North Richmond Community Health Centre, and I also manage the sexual health arm of CEH, as well as MDAP, which is the Multicultural Drug and Alcohol Partnership, which I'll talk to you about a little bit later. So the topics we're going to cover today are around structural barriers, like examining what those are and what your understanding is, and I guess later on down the track, actually thinking about strategies that you can impact those, as well as thinking about what are the impediments to you actually doing some, making some changes in those areas. We'll also be talking about cultural competency in a very broad way, and we'll be doing an activity around that and the strategies to implement within your own services. And then we'll be talking about principles of engagement, and these are the bits where I'll be asking you lots of questions around what you think principles of engagement are for your service. So qualifying again, you know your services better than I do. Most of you, well, actually all of you have been working in the AOD space far longer than I have. And my personal career history is since 1994, so more than 25 years, been working directly with refugees. So whether I'm talking about applying these skills to AOD specifically, or education, or sexual health, some of those basic fundamental principles are the same. Okay, so as service providers, some of the things we need to think about with this client group So people from multicultural backgrounds, and in particular refugee backgrounds. Some of the things we would need to think about would be their past experiences. So unlike some of the other clients you might actually be providing good services to, some of the other issues on top of that regular trauma need to be considered. So there is potentially a prolonged camp experience. Often, for instance, with some communities, some young people were born in camps, have never been back to country of, familial origin. There is also a whole raft of experiences that means that they have already got potentially some identity issues. While they're in camps, there could be other health issues that we need to consider about their growth and their development. So potentially poorer nutrition, oral health, and because they've not been in a formal education system, and I'm talking about refugees specifically here, some of them will have really low literacy levels. Some will have really low health literacy levels. If people are curious to find out more about health literacy, please go to the website, or you can ask me questions now. So with low levels of literacy, it's really interesting because often in a camp situation, young people will learn to read and write at a very low proficiency level, but not necessarily in their first language. So this is another thing we have to think about when we're wanting to translate lots of information. Do young people, or do the client group we're trying to meet the needs of, actually read their own language of origin? One of the other things about living in a camp situation is there's definitely negative perceptions of authority. And then on arrival, there are reconfigured families. When I say reconfigured families, what I'm talking about is, say, supposing a mother comes out of a camp under one of the humanitarian entrant categories, such as women at risk. She'll come with her children, but they will sponsor over potentially the father to come over. He might not arrive for 7 years. So in that 7-year period, post-settlement, young people have acquired language, have started to make networks, whereas the father comes back and some of that is actually very challenging. And it really significantly contributes to intergenerational conflict. So one person thinking in the old ways with traditional practices and beliefs and cultural expectations and gender norms, for instance, as opposed to the young people who've already been here for 7 years or whatever, who've already managed to acquire language and a whole range of things and understand a little bit more. So what that actually does, for the first time, for instance, in a, post-colonial patriarchal father, for instance, that actually sets up a new power dynamic that has never been experienced before culturally. So that's quite an important thing for us to consider. And what that must be like to parent in a new context, in a new culture, thinking about all the things that are available, and also parents feeling that they have lost control of their children. They can no longer, assuming that not all families hit their children, but discipline is a really critical part of some of those boundaries that parents set up. So in Australia, obviously, that is not acceptable. So what are the skills that we need to support parents with around that sort of stuff? Now, the journey experience itself might have been quite complex. Often people walk across different countries, captured, sent back to jail in their home country. And so it's quite complex, and the journey experience could take, 3 days if you're airlifted, or it could take many years. So these are other things about the destabilisation and the sort of the psychological impact that might have on the client group that we're trying to engage with. Once they arrive, of course, there's navigation issues. Like, how do I get an appointment to see this person? How do I do those things? What services are available? If you've come from a place where mental health services don't actually exist, it's quite phenomenal that you'd be expected to understand how to book appointments and engage with mental health service if you don't actually understand how they. So a lot of hand holding needs to actually occur by services that work with these communities. So we need to also consider the cultural factors and the stigma within communities. And one of the most stigmatising issues for communities dealing with currently is the AOD, problematic AOD use. And I'd actually extend that to say AOD availability more broadly in communities. So parents really struggle with that. So we're going to move on to, so that's just the background. Do people have any questions about that? No? Okay, so we'll talk about some of the structural and systemic barriers that people face. So I'm actually going to stop sharing for a second, and I'm actually going to ask people to talk about that now. So we can actually have a little bit of a discussion about what our understanding is of what the structural impediments are for, number one, for our service delivery, and number two, for clients actually accessing our service. So I might actually ask Chris Platt. No. Okay, so Ayla, is it Ayla? Ayla Hope?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Hi.
can you just talk about what you think those barriers are, and so that we can actually have a discussion if there are any points of difference or things that people want to add.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. I mean, I think it's huge and multi-layered. My understanding. I ran a refugee and migrant program around mental health when I worked in the southeast, and we were in close consultation with the Afghan community down there, and in particular, one of the things that I found really interesting was we were speaking of we were trying to run a program around mental health support for refugee people. And we actually had to wind our whole conceptualization all the way back because the concept of mental health itself was not something that was recognized by that community as there wasn't an ability to even translate those words in a meaningful way. So we needed to wind our understanding all the way back to the place where it's like, how can we describe what a mental health problem looks like when we don't have the word mental health, and needed to sort of start to draw out understandings. We worked really closely with leaders in the community down there around it might show up as difficulty sleeping, or it might show up as like your heart pounding in certain ways, or difficult memories circulating, and really, yeah, I think in the first instance, one of the significant barriers is around kind of discourse and language, and what services mean when we say a thing versus the ability to communicate that, even just in the first instance to identify need, let alone the way that the service system is structured, and yeah, the point you made earlier about people may not actually read in their language of origin. So we think we're being so culturally inclusive by translating materials and resources, but in written form, but that may not actually improve access in the way that that we might be expecting. I don't know, I feel like there's so much more to say, but I'll...
Yes, no, that's great. That's fantastic. I guess that's why I didn't have 35 slides just on that one issue. I just thought it's really good for us to just sort of unpack different people's understandings of what that is. And some of those, I mean, clearly you just talked about, you've articulated a strategy that you've used to sort of mitigate that problem. So yeah, so I might get Rennie or Renee. Sorry if I've said it incorrectly. Oh no, you're still, yeah, can't hear you.
How's that?
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah.
So, hi, I'm Renee from Odyssey. Some of the things that came to mind as you were talking was looking at some of the communities that we have been involved with in the past. And one of the issues has been around, because of culture or religion, the AOD issue in their own culture isn't necessarily an issue. And the fact that they've arrived in Australia, there's access and availability. There's also a sense of affluence around that as well. And so they very quickly may engage in alcohol and substance use. The other factor that came to mind as well was in regard to, because the family structure may be a bit different, people have adopted new roles in that family structure. For example, the eldest son or the eldest daughter may take on some new roles, and then another family member comes in, and so like the fact that they've stepped back into the family model, that reshapes or it needs to be rebalanced in regard to how the new person has joined in versus the roles that other people have taken up, given that they've been absent and that sort of thing. And trying to balance out continuing on with their cultural structure, as well as adopting a new cultural structure.
Yeah, those are really, really good points. And I think that we cannot take for granted the impact of a reconfigured family and the dynamics and the power shifting that occurs with that. And also some of the push factors, I guess, for refugee young people when they're leaving home, significantly around family conflict. Okay. So regarding structural barriers, I'm going to ask Jasmine, if you're comfortable, would you like to make a couple of comments about adding to what's been said already, or some of the thoughts that you've sort of been thinking about in your workplace, and what are some of the structural barriers, in particular regarding AOD service provision to newly arrived communities?
I have to apologise. I was having some technical getting in the beginning, so I actually missed the intro. So if I double up or say something that's already been said, apologies. Yeah, look, I think there's so many structural barriers. I think the very nature of how our organisations are built around appointments and wait times and referral processes, and the ways that people enter into the AOD sector or any health organisation is laden with cultural assumptions around people's understanding of preventative health or health in general and how they access services. System navigation, knowing how to access the information, where the services are, what they do, how they can help, is another structural barrier. Issues around cultural safety is really huge. We do an AOD prevention project with people from the Chin community in the West, and a lot of the there's multiple layers around people not having trust in the organisations because they don't know anybody who works there and they're not representative of the communities that they aim to serve. It's predominantly a white community. Issues around having to engage with interpreters and fears around confidentiality or not understanding confidentiality. Experiences of lack of cultural safety when walking into an organisation who doesn't have a comprehensive understanding of their cultural belief systems and ways of knowing and belief around drug and alcohol use. And yeah, and so I guess lots of stuff as well around people engaging with community leaders and faith leaders, especially within that community for supports, and drug and alcohol being a really new issue in the communities because it's not something that those people faced or engaged with necessarily back home because it wasn't as prevalent or as available. And yeah, so lots of stuff. Lots of stuff.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. So did anybody else want to add anything else?
I just think, speaking to the point that Jasmine just made around, she touched on the point about interpreters. One of the difficulties in some communities is that they can be quite small, and the difficulty with maintaining confidentiality when engaging with certain interpreters who may in fact be known to the client, or maybe from an opposing, potentially oppressing cultural group who that can be intensely problematic.
Absolutely, I agree with you. So going back to Jasmine then, what are some of the strategies that you would use then, knowing that interpreters can be a really difficult thing for your client to accept?
I guess there's a few different things. We often recommend if it's a small community group and a sensitive topic for that community, looking at using phone interpreters from interstate, and assuring people, calling people to let them know that you'll do that prior to them turning up to an appointment to improve prospects of engagement. And also, you know, there's mixed reports or beliefs around whether or not having a diverse workforce representative of the communities is a positive or a negative in those situations where it is heavily stigmatised. But the feedback that we often get is that people won't even enter into an organisation unless there's a recommendation or a link to safety from somebody else in their community. So even if it's not a staff member, having potentially who they might engage with, having bicultural workers on the periphery to be supporting and educating community about the existence of services can be really valuable as well.
Fabulous. Well, Jasmine, you've just answered many, many questions. But I think that the point that you made there is exactly what we would advise around interpreters, for instance, that are requesting an interpreter over the phone from interstate. But because we're talking about small communities, there is no guarantee that they might not know each other. Especially if communities come from the same region, for instance, or whatever, and those sort of kinship networks and familiar networks are quite strong and far-reaching. So, but it is actually absolutely the best way to go forward is to think about those issues. So yes, no, thank you very much for sharing. Are there any other? Oh, Naomi?
Could I just ask a question? I know this but the idea of, do we understand what kind of training interpreters actually have around if they're going to be involved in providing counselling or providing any other kind of pretty confidential service? Could you explain, if you're aware of it, could you explain what kind of training or preparation they have to do that?
Okay. So Pierre Morrow, who is one of a person on our team, we've been talking about this issue for a long time. I mean, years. We actually want a particular accreditation for NAATI, and so those conversations will be happening when I get some time, regarding interpreting for sensitive issues. And AOD isn't the only sensitive issues these communities are dealing with. Some of them are dealing with family violence. Some of them are dealing with sexual health issues. So there are examples, for instance, where an interpreter has gone with a young person and has just left the consultation because the young person's disclosed that they're same-sex attracted and all these sort of things. So basic little tips that I can give you right now is to ensure that if you ever do have a face-to-face interpreter, please don't leave them in a space, in a waiting room with your client. Because often at that point, when we're talking about tiny communities that know each other very well, that is at that point where they'll start asking questions like, oh, whereabouts are you from in Afghanistan? Blah, blah, blah. And as soon as you do that, your regional networks are exposed, and who your familial heritage is totally exposed as well. So one of the most important things is to keep them separated till your consultation. The second, well, actually, I'd say this is the most important thing as well. There's lots of important things we've got to consider. So I would say that the pre-briefing with your interpreter, whether that's on the phone and putting them on hold while you bring in the client, or not letting them be out in the wait room with your client and bringing them in first and having a pre-briefing about what this session is going to, what you're trying to achieve, okay? Unfortunately, there are lots of issues with interpreters. I encourage everybody to put in complaints. I know sometimes in our work we think, I don't have time for that, I've just got to do the next thing, we're all really busy. But until we complain and the system is addressed, there'll be no change. So all those issues around confidentiality are a real risk. And if you're trying to build a rapport and most importantly trust with your new client or whatever, you need to be able to feel a little bit confident that information will not be shared within the community, in their church group or wherever. That is a fundamental thing. And so the pre-briefing is really important to confirm that level of confidentiality, the trust that this person really needs, and what you need to get out of the session, and keep it really tight. I think it's much better to organise, you know, another session next week, because it is a slower process using interpreters and getting your key message across. And in particular, if you're talking about something like harm reduction, strategies for that, because that is as foreign as mental health is. Okay, so, and we will talk a little bit about that later. Have I answered all the sort of things around strategies with interpreters? Oh, okay, and the post briefing, okay? That's really important for you and us as clinicians, or providing support to clients, because, for instance, what's really useful is because it improves your practice. So, for instance, after a session, a interpreter might say, Ali, you just spoke so quickly, and we were only supposed to do 3 points, 3 key messages, and you just kept going. The young person walked out not understanding anything that happened, and it's not a lack of skill on my part about interpreting, but they were lost. And given that we understand with health literacy, whether it's a doctor's consultation or a meeting with a worker, only a certain small percentage of that information is carried forward. And we're hoping that when we do good messaging, that there will be potentially some behavioural change or better health outcomes. That's what we all aim for. However, that's why the post briefing is really important, because they might say, actually, that was really good. That's why I asked you to give them more, because they followed really well. It was clear and whatever. So getting that information from your interpreter that you've used helps you build a relationship with them, and hopefully you'll get them again. But it also teaches you it provides you with more tools to improve your practice around that. And language is critical. One of the most important things to consider about language, and I really like using the reference of Auslan, which is all pictures, and it is a beautiful language, okay? the way that people speak and language is completely culturally contextual. Okay, so so people have different sayings, different phrases, which also means that their vocabulary doesn't necessarily extend to mental health or harm reduction and a whole range of things. So that, you know, those are some of the things that we can consider as well. Now, Chris, I'm going to say Chris with the beanie.
Yes. Hello.
Would you like to add anything? Or are there any things that you're thinking are structural barriers? So I think the interpreter issue is really important. There are barriers to it, but I encourage you to report, complain, and there's some advocacy work that will be coming next year.
I was just thinking about, so I work for Catholic Care, and we employ bicultural workers in AOD space. So we don't have the issue of interpreters, but we have issues of you know, people knowing each other in personal settings, and so it's really challenging in terms of boundaries, because our practitioners are called, you know, all over the weekend and at night. So we've had to do a lot of work around being really strict around your work times, and now we need to be really careful about what happens after hours, and, you know, what supports are in place for the client group. So it's been a real challenge for us to be able to be really firm and fair around that, because they're just wanting to help their community, but, you know, we need to put some boundaries around that. But I would agree around positive word of mouth. Like, we really haven't had to advertise or promote or anything, because it's all just from the community saying, look, this person will help you out because they understand what you're going through. So that does remove some of the stigma, but yeah, it does raise a real challenge around, yeah, how we support those boundaries and those professional standards, I suppose.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think about that. And so this is a structural thing that I consider all the time. We've got clinical governance. We've got a whole range of things that put boundaries around some of the work. So the challenge, I guess, and you just talked about bicultural workers, is that whose boundaries are those? And how effective are they actually in engaging these communities? And what is some of the work that actually needs to be done to make sure that everyone is safe, our clients and our staff, but that we're able to work in a way that's a bit more flexible and engaging with these communities. So I think that there is a real balance. Actually, there is a tension. And we're talking about people from collectivist communities as opposed to individualist. So I'll use an example. When I get up in the morning and I get dressed to go to work, no, actually, I'm going to turn this around. So Jasmine, for instance. Jasmine, when you get up to go to work in the mornings, like pre-COVID times where things were sort of relatively normal, could you please tell me what are some of the things, just a couple of little points, what are some of the things that you're thinking about getting dressed to go to work?
What am I going to wear?
Yeah.
Do I have to go anywhere? Do I need to wear comfortable shoes?
Yeah.
Do you mean specifically around in that time, or?
Yeah, no, that's fine. And that's what, that is the assumption that all of us have. Isn't that right? That when you're getting to work, you go, oh, what meeting have I got? La, 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 I've only got a little bit of break. I do need to get something to eat, blah, blah, blah. What am I wearing? Do I look good because I've got that fancy meeting with the department or the min has stuff, whatever. Now, when bicultural workers get dressed to go to work, or when I do, for instance, I get dressed and what I'm putting on is community expectations, aspirations, their hopes for a better structure and a system that will meet their needs. So the pressure, I guess, that your bicultural workers have is quite phenomenal, even before they walk in the door at 9 o'clock in the morning or whenever you start. So those are some of the things that we need to think about that are very real. So people will ring them up at 10:30 at night. People do ring me up at 10:30 at night about a community issue or something like that. How do we support people to do that and create those boundaries, but with a level of understanding that this is a different This is a different landscape to the landscape I'm assuming because I work in a Western model of service delivery, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Good. Okay, so we might go back to the slides. Can you see me when I've got the slides on? You can't, can you? Oh, you can. Oh, okay. Didn't realise that. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay. All right, so thanks for sharing all of that. And one thing I didn't qualify right at the start of this is that all of you have significant experience and understanding in these. So really, the most important thing for me is that you are able to feel free to ask questions and unpack some of those issues that you've noticed and barriers that you've encountered. So I guess when we're talking about, so this is just a summary of additional things to consider. So so working with refugee migrant populations around AOD, some of the other things to consider are that there is a disproportionate representation in the justice system, second only to the incarceration rates of our First Nations people. There's limited culturally safe and competent services, and this is a perception, not necessarily a judgment of all of our services, but this is definitely a perception that communities do have about some services. And what Chris said earlier was really important, because it's the word of mouth, it's how welcoming you are, how safe they feel when they come there, or whether a friend or a family member or one of their networks has received good care from you. That will increase and diminish that sense that you're not culturally safe or welcoming. So one of the other things that I think is a really structural issue that I touched on before is, what are the service models? So do the service models deal with the issues that are presenting? So that could be the dual diagnosis issue, which everybody's challenged by, which is mental health, as well as AOD issues. But what are the service models and how are we adapting our service models? What is the flexibility that we can deliver a service regarding dual diagnosis, but also the fact that a lot of community members will not walk into a service. The same reason why community members won't go to Pronto, the rapid testing HIV service. It outs them. It outs them in the community, and the shame and stigma that a lot of people traumatised who have problematic drug use experience is multiplied significantly from the additional cultural and social stigma experienced. Another issue, I guess, that sets this group apart from some of your other clients that you're seeing is the fear of deportation. And it's not just a fear, it's actually happened to quite a number of young people. So we do know, as I mentioned to you before, for example, with young people being born in a camp, they might come here, they might never become citizens, they're permanent residents, but we've got migration laws that change and shift, and landscapes change and shift. And one of the things that is very notable that I think some of you would already be aware of is that currently the detention centres for deportation are filled with people from New Zealand and also South Sudanese young men. So, and we're talking about Pacifica communities as opposed to white New Zealanders necessarily. Okay, so I guess those structural barriers for me, if I was summing up what's in front of my screen, I would say a lot of those touch on racism. So one of the things, I guess, that we would think that would really support services, and this is the work that CH has been doing for a really long time. So again, this is overarching. This is not specifically targeting AOD. We'll come to that in our discussions. But looking at the idea of what cultural competency is. Okay, so the definition is cultural competence is a set of congruent behaviours. It's a set of attitudes and policies that come together in a system, in an agency, among professionals, enabling that system, an agency or professionals to work effectively in a cross-cultural situation. So the important thing following on from what we've just discussed around structural issues is that it doesn't just focus on individual attitudes, okay? It does focus on some of the structural stuff, which is around policy development. And we could be talking strictly about organisational policy here. We could be thinking about system policy and the structures and the resources that we're funded under and by. So, so that's the broader definition. And it's an old definition. And I guess the thing that that's come up before in the discussion as well is the importance of cultural safety as well. And I guess when I look at both of those things together, I go, cultural competency will support your organisation to do a better job. Being culturally safe will protect your clients. So I think the worst thing that we could imagine is thinking that we have damaged our clients or not made them feel safe in our services. And we do know from research that the biggest impact on long-term health outcomes and engagement with health services for the Aboriginal community, for instance, is a negative experience in one of those services. So they won't go back. And it's the same for our communities as well. So the cultural competency domains are organisational values. So how do we demonstrate that our organisation actually places cultural competency as a bit of a priority or even considers it to be important? What's our governance structure look like? So how do we embed cultural competency in our organisations via advisory groups, policies, standards and goals? Now, at this point is where we start to make a bit of a difference. And what this doesn't talk about is the importance of decision making. So people should have a say, have a decision-making right on things that affect their communities, their health and well-being. So this is a really important strategy to think about as well. Then there's all the other stuff. Now, all of you would be inundated with reporting, monitoring, evaluation, planning. Now, it's not a huge ask to say, let's add on a couple of little things that will actually help us measure how we're going around cultural competency. Communication. So we've already mentioned, there was a really good example before about having information translated and translated materials, and how effective is that? So I guess, you know, these are things we've already discussed, but effective communication, going with plain language is, you know, the foundational starting point that we would really support. Effective communication, clear signage, all those sort of things really help people navigate because it's not text-based. It is visual cues, really support people's understanding of expectations and things like that. Staff development. So Chris with the beanie, mentioned earlier that he's got bicultural workers in his service, which is fantastic. One of the most important things, I guess, to consider then is once you've brought in workers from different backgrounds into a structure and a setting that has already been established, they're already on the, not on the outer, but they are the new people with a new culture and have to adapt to what is already existent. Importantly, we need to consider the staff that were already there who are actually now dealing with not just changes with their clients and responding to different needs, but they're also now working with diversity in a way that they perhaps never have. So equipping staff with good training around how to be more culturally competent. What are some of the cultural things that we need to do? And this follows on, because next week, and I encourage all of you to encourage your staff, next week Pierre will be delivering a session, not like this one, but actual training to practitioners in the Northwest region. So that supports your staff to think about these issues, but also what's the practical implications of them as well. So having those two ideas around staff development is really, really critical. So one, the established staff need to be trained on how to work with diversity. Secondly, we need to think about what other supports that we're putting in place for these new staff members, the bicultural workers. Often services will just have one, so I was so happy to hear that you've got more than one. And the pressure and the isolation experienced by that one is quite significant. So thinking about what support that person requires, understanding also what is their story and how that needs to be in the back of your mind, because that will frame how they work, what their practice is, and the implications regarding their community. So organisational infrastructure, how do you identify within your organisation what's important, what's not important? And then service interventions. So there was I think it was Jasmine, no, it wasn't Jasmine, it was Aaliyah, that said earlier that they'd done focus groups, they'd worked with community leaders to actually unpack what was actually needed by that community. So that's a great, so that's the pre-intervention. That is us actually thinking about a particular tailoring of strategies to meet the needs of specific communities. And incidentally, just as I throw out there, because we're talking about principles here and we're not talking about specific community needs, this is just thoughts for you to go away and think about, because you might have a different community to clients than another area as well. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do a small group activity, and we're going to talk about areas. So using the cultural competency framework, I've just put in a couple of examples, for instance, okay? So the one that is out there right now is, so leadership and investment in documentation, investment and documentation, okay? So consulting, so one of the actions that we could take is we could consult with stakeholders, which is what the example I just used earlier. We could look at a development of a position statement and a policy. So for instance, some organisations have a really lovely reconciliation statement. Do we need to do something more broadly around diversity? And then how would we measure that? What would be the performance measure around that? So, so we might have the statement developed. We might have some things that are documented within our policies and that they are reviewed annually, or what is usual for your service. We could think about establishing external and internal audit groups. But my understanding of your sector is that often there is very limited time to all stop and let's do an audit. So some strategies around that is that you can actually get someone in to help you to do that, okay? But resources are very finite and you might not have resources to even engage another person to do that for you. However, what you can do is, again, you've done a lot of documentation, you have to do a lot of documentation. So thinking about how you use the information you've already got to give you a better picture of how you deliver a culturally competent services. And you could think about doing a survey across your organisation and doing some sort of dashboard type thing to see how you're going this year. So there are complex ways of doing it, but there are really simple, quicker ways of doing it as well. So what I want to do now so that's just the examples that I jotted down. What I would like you to do now is to go out into breakout rooms, and Naomi kindly is going to organise that. and we are going to look at a few areas. So we've got standardised data. You don't have to pick these areas, by the way. We've got standardised data, we've got language services, we've got emerging community needs, and we've got health literacy. So, Naomi, we might break up into, actually, I'm going to come back to the groups and see which topics they're interested in. So which ones are the most pertinent for you now to discuss? We're going to break up for 5 minutes. So we've got language services, we've got, of course, I've just lost my screen there. So we've got a number of things that I'm hoping that, okay, I did have it set up in my email as well, but I've just got another 40 emails, so I can't find it. So I think, so are the areas that I just read out, areas that you would like to discuss further in small groups, or other things that we've actually missed that you think are critical to cultural competency?
Sorry, can you repeat the topics, topics again?
Sure. Okay. Right. Okay, so we've got standardised data. Okay, and so I guess the action could be collect and review information around clients. We could use that information to inform practice. Okay, so that's number one is data. Number two is language services. So we could do things around training staff to use interpreters effectively, some of the stuff that we've already discussed. We could get tools in for them. Third topic, community needs. So how are we going to do that? What are the actions we're going to take to meet the changing needs of communities and different population groups? And the last one I'd suggest is health literacy. So when we talk about health literacy, this is also, I guess, when we're talking about AOD, it relates specifically to things like understanding harm reduction strategies would be the biggest thing that we know that communities at the moment really struggle with. Okay, so those are the 4 topics: health literacy, emerging communities, language services, and data. And I'll flick back to all of you now. Are there other topics that you really need to sort of unpack a little bit? I mean, we're having 5 minutes, but we're going to have that discussion afterwards. No? Okay, so we've got 12 participants. So we could pick, we can do all 4 topics with 3 people in them each. So what I might suggest is, can I just call out which groups you'll be in? People happy with that? Okay.
Ali, I think that's a bit tricky because we don't know what groups people are going in. It does it automatically.
Oh, it does it automatically. Okay. All right. So there's 4 groups. So how would I know which groups they're going into?
You don't.
I don't.
You can, there is a way that you can automatically assign everybody into a breakout group and then reshuffle them on the basis of people's priorities, but you'd need a list and know what people's priorities were to do that. It might be easier just to shuffle everyone and you get what you're given. I'm happy with that.
Okay, that sounds good to me. So
go with lucky dip.
It's only 5 minutes. I really just wanted you to look at one thing each, but I think what we'll do is try and look at all of them and shuffle around to see if there's any differences, and we'll feed back to the bigger group. How does that sound? Okay.
Ali, can I just say, sorry, there's actually 9 participants.
Oh, there's 9.
No, there's myself, you and Naomi in that 12.
Oh, there is. Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. Okay, 4 groups of 2 and 1 group of 3. Oh, look at me and my maths. Great. Host is inviting you to join. Okay, lovely. Welcome back. It's very quick, isn't it? Everything is so much quicker online, isn't it? Like we would be doing this training for 3 or 4 hours in face-to-face, but we're just whipping through it. So I'm just going to, if people are happy, if there's no volunteers, I'll just be calling out names again. Right, so we'll just start. So what were some of the things that you guys discussed and came up with around those 4 things? Data, language, and other 2 that I've forgotten again. So what are some of the things that you've come up with that you thought could be actions that your organisation could actually implement? Yep.
You can go, Ayla. Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Sure. Yeah, Corinne and I were in a little room together, and we found the time restraint challenging. But what we did do was name the one that we were both drawn to, which was around the community needs piece. And I don't know if we necessarily came up with specific strategies, but we did raise a bunch of questions. And what we discussed was, it was a couple of points really. One strategy that Corinne raised was around collaborating with specific services. So once we know that we have a representation of a particular cultural group that we need to improve service to meet their needs better, that we actually engage with a service that's already sort of accepted by or accessed by or appropriately servicing that group, and work collaboratively with them as well in order to sort of tailor a service response. We also, we were both asking questions around how do we as services understand emerging community needs. So how do we know that needs are emerging? How do we work to best address those and amend practice to improve it or stop doing a thing that we might not have been aware was harmful. Mm-hmm. And then the third point was, because I think both of those things come back to sort of a need for feedback loops, to really understand what the needs are in the first place, and then to know what to do about them. And we spoke of the difficulty really around servicing clients who may be in crisis. So I work for Flat Out. Oftentimes our clients aren't housed and have substance use challenges and the rest, as well as experiences of criminalisation. So how do we design feedback loops that can work to improve service, which actually does improve services for clients at a big loop back, but doesn't necessarily address the fires that need putting out today? And just wondering about how we balance meeting a specific individual's needs with meeting the service needs that are broader about meeting more individuals' needs. And then we had 4 seconds, 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second, we were back.
Right. I'm so happy that you talked about that, because I just said that I was hoping that people would start to broaden this out. So what you're talking about is other impacts that affect this one client in front of you in crisis, but there's a plethora of other things that have happened, and how do we meet those? The question you asked was really interesting, and so I'm actually going to throw that out to the rest of the group. I know we're sort of a little bit challenged for time, but the question that you asked was really interesting, and I want to know what other people think about what the solution is, or what are some of the strategies we can use to address that. Do you want to repeat the question again?
Was it the one about feedback loops?
No, the one before that.
How to understand emerging community needs?
Yes. So how would we do that? How would we go about understanding emerging community needs?
Basically build networks with people that are all working with asylum seekers and refugees. you know, and then ask them, you know.
Yep, perfect, Jim. Any other ideas what we might do?
I know that in some of our other programs, we'd look at particular trends that are coming out of the data. So, we might try and complement that with interviews or feedback from people who are able to give us that feedback at the time. But we're also kind of looking at, what's the common presenting substance use? How are people using those substances? And kind of using that sort of information to look at trends that are coming out.
And I mean, so that's both of you have answered perfectly, because what I really wanted to see is that there was two levels to that answer. I guess that is that you're looking at data, okay, and looking at what the evidence is out there as well. But you're also speaking directly to communities that are affected. However, just with a little caveat there, is that often when we speak to community members, we often go straight to the community leaders. Okay, now they have a really different idea of harm reduction. For them, it's our communities don't take drugs. For some of them, not all of them. So these are also I guess thinking about the diversity within communities. So an older male from the South Sudanese community might think quite differently to a 20-year-old. So, just keeping those in mind as well. But really, I guess those ideas around looking at the data, the evidence, what's out there, who's doing what, and meeting up with communities and partnering with them to get the information directly from them is the perfect way to do it.
Can I just add to that? It's important to look at the data, but it's also important to reflect back in regard to, like, I think in the areas that we work with, the general demographic might mean that there's a larger number of a particular community group in that geographical area. Often my question is, if I look at the data and say that there's a large number of that cohort in the area, and then I extrapolate that a percentage of the general population would possibly be using this, that, or the other substance. My question is not in regard to who's coming, but who's not coming into the service and why.
Renee, that's the perfect answer. We're going back to the structural barriers and issues. Okay, so we all know what the evidence is around multicultural AOD use and access to services. BARDA have done this work, and John wrote a great report a couple of years back that really did say that there's huge issues. They're not accessing our services, so really what's going on? What are we doing? Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to keep going, and hopefully we'll have time, if there's burning questions that have just come up from that little discussion, to come back to, okay? So, share the screen again. Okay, so here we go. So now we've talked about, I guess we've just moved through some of the culturally competent things we can do for our organisations at that organisational level. And this has been mentioned before, but thinking about sort of the individual or their community and that sense around cultural safety. So the term came from New Zealand. I think we know the history of it. It's most used and I guess associated with our First Nations people. However, feeling culturally safe is important to all of us. That is our supporting our staff, which we discussed really briefly before around the bicultural staff. What are the extra things we're putting in place for them? Are we considering that the regular supervision we allocate to our regular staff, is that sufficient? Is the person that's doing that supervision, do they understand the cultural complexity of this bicultural worker engaged in this sector? So how are we supporting our clients? as well. How are we making them feel safe? Are we just assuming that our service, one size fits all, so it's open and people can come in when they want? And we know, working with refugees and migrants, we know with Aboriginal communities that that is not the case. We do need a level of tailoring. We do need specific strategies, okay? We need to consider what our models of practice are, and we need to find out what's needed. And we've just answered some of those questions. So this just summarises a lot of the things that you've already been talking about. Okay, that's not moving. It's stuck. Sorry about this. Technology. Okay. So now I want to come back to us. So one of the strategies we decided to engage in a little while ago, and this is why I'm sort of speaking to you, because one of the things that we want to do is to look at the sector and how we can support the sector to shift a little bit, to think about a different approach, to work more collectively together to get change to happen at a structural level. Okay, so that's my, I guess that's our agenda. But most importantly, to meet the needs of particular communities. So a little while ago, the PHN, the Northwestern PHN, and we've got Liesl here and Lisa here as well, decided to fund a program that has never really been done before anywhere. Okay, so it's the Multicultural Drug and Alcohol Partnership. The partnership involves, and I'll just go through what everyone's doing. So CEH is not running this on its own. Our key partners are, supporting co-design. Even the initial model was co-designed with the community that was going to be targeted. Okay, so Burnett Institute are doing our evaluation. We're creating a evaluation framework specifically for this program. We've got Turning Point providing our clinical services to young people. We've got VADA involved, and this is one of 2 sessions per year we will be doing with the sector to talk about the specific issues around multicultural AOD use. Then we've got Drummond Street Services, who are very supportive of the working with family component that we're doing, and the South Sudanese Mothers Coalition, who supported the co-development of the initial design and model. And I think it's involving communities right from that stage and not pulling them in as an add-on later on going, hey, we're thinking of this, when it's already developed. So this program took 2 years of strong advocacy to get up and running, because its unusual nature of the model as well. We're just extremely grateful to the PHN for actually thinking this might work, and we're building evidence to show how we can all work better. So we are focusing, and just for clarity, we're focusing on the South Sudanese community. We're focusing in the Yarra area. Beyond that, the core partnership, we've got many other partnerships as well. So the actual core elements to the model is we provide in-home care and support, not treatment, but we provide referrals. The concept is that 2 workers go into a home. 1 worker works directly with the young person with AOD issues, and the other worker works with the families around parenting in a new context, parenting support, and because we've talked about, how important the sort of the impact of intergenerational conflict is. Another component is peer education, and someone mentioned it earlier as an idea. it works. So what we're doing is we're looking at for young people, training them up to understand what harm reduction is, where the services are, so that they can be out in the community talking to their own community. This is, I mean, they trust each other. We don't need to get other staff involved. Then we've got community capacity building. So again, understanding access issues, supply issues, the issues that communities are finding. There are so many adults post-refugee experience that take addictive opioids daily because one of the symptoms, I guess, of having those sort of backgrounds is that you do get aches and pains. It's part of your trauma. So those sort of, that education within the community is really important, as well as broadly looking at addressing stigma around this issue and people seeking help, and how to support other families. For instance, in this situation, South Sudanese, it would be other families in your church group that you know are struggling. Where do they go to get help? And then the last component is the sector development. And look, I've put transformation there. I'm very hopeful. This also explains the model in greater detail, some of the things we're going to be doing. We don't have time to go over that now. I guess the thing that we discovered, looking at the evidence, and in particular the evidence that VADA had undertaken, was that there was a need for co-designed, an approach with particular communities. That because communities have come to us and have identified that they don't necessarily feel, and this is a perception, coming back to that again, that services offer them something that's culturally sensitive or safe, that they feel that accessing that service would trigger more shame and stigma felt by their community potentially. Also, fundamentally, they didn't know where to go. And also to understand that the help-seeking behaviour of communities, their own cultural, religious and health beliefs also impact on how they approach services and the models that they will engage with. So, for instance, the idea, the concept of counselling is completely alien and foreign to many communities. So what are some of the things that would work? A lot of the work that we do is around working with groups and things like that, but you have to ensure that there is trust and safety. I've just talked about all this, and that's the end of the slideshow. And we've got just under 15 minutes to talk about what do we think the most important principles are in our work. So now that we've thought a little bit about cultural competency, we've looked at one of the strategies that we've implemented with strong support from partners. What are some of the things that you think would improve the way you engage with diversity, in your client group? See, if it goes quiet, you're just asking me to point at people again. Laura, I haven't actually heard from you, Laura. Would you like to to share with us what you think some of the key principles might be? So those overarching ideas that could support us to engage better with communities. Okay, Laura's not there. I might go to Leonie, because Leonie's there.
Just unmuting. Look, I think it goes back to the, looking at the assumptions that we make about what's going to suit people, how we're going to attract people into treatment. And I really like Trene's point around, let's look at who's not accessing the service. How do we look at who's not accessing the service if we don't have data on them, and how do we meet their needs? And I think, sort of marrying that with, okay, we actually have to find out who's instrumental in the community and who hasn't as well got a voice so much in that community potentially. So looking at it sort of from a lot of different perspectives, and that kind of trying to find out and be curious about what it is that we don't know as a service, you know. So yeah, going back to being curious and wanting to understand more about the community that we're working with or not working with. I think certainly in Coburg Uniting Regen, we acknowledge that whilst there's quite a high Indigenous community in Darebin, we don't service them particularly well in our therapeutic programs other than our detox service. So looking at, you know, what is it that will allow someone to engage in potentially in a detox? Is it that someone else in the community has had a positive experience with that? Can we tap into those networks? And really, I guess, an avenue for communicating on a regular basis with people in the community. That they feel comfortable accessing, not that we feel comfortable working with necessarily.
Yeah. And at the risk of being reductive, so if I'm looking and I'm thinking about a principle that you've just articulated, wealth, and you know, you've talked about multifaceted approaches and things like that, which is absolutely critical. One of the key things that I've drawn out, and other people might have drawn out something else as well, is the partnership idea, is partnering directly with communities. And how do we do that? Who are these people that we need to speak to? So again, community leaders are useful, but they often and at times act as gatekeepers. You will not have access to the rest of the community, okay? So, and that's to do with a whole range of things that we've discussed before, such as, you know, the stigma or that doesn't happen in my community, that type of thing. So even when we're engaging in partnerships and to find out more about our communities, we need to do that on a multi-level. We need to actually be speaking to young people themselves or whoever the main cohort is that is affected that you're trying to tap into. Speaking to mothers as well is one of the really important things, because one thing with the program and the strategy we've come up with is that very little services, so whether you're talking about mental health services or AOD services, work with the parents. Now, unless you're going to engage the parents or the community, some of this work, based on my experience, anecdotally, just won't work. So we want young people, we know the protective factor around being engaged with your community or your family, we just don't want to sever that. And unfortunately, the perception with a lot of communities is that the service models that we engage in, for instance, mental health, will only work with the young person. And the parents who really are concerned, who've had to live through this, who want to provide additional support, they have no idea what's going on. They don't know any strategies to help people. They don't even understand what mental health is. So just thinking about how can we engage broadly, and that's through different partnerships, whether that is with, so in our case, we are partnering with their families and the communities and other young people to ensure there's a bit more wraparound. But one thing that I guess an additional thing to think about though is I acknowledge that we are in an incredibly privileged position because we've managed to get this massive wraparound type model together and have been supported to do that by the Northwest PHN. That's not the case for everybody, and we all have to work within the restraints and confines of the expectations of our funding bodies and things like that. So pointing towards the evaluation, which Naomi will be sending out either now or shortly, is I really encourage you to think about the additional things you need and what's not happening for you. Is it a restraint? Are you feeling restrained by your service agreements with your funding bodies? Are you feeling restrained in the way that this is doing all this work that you suggest, building those partnerships takes time and we don't actually have that? So what is the additional support that you might need at a really structural, systemic level? And on a practical level, please do phone me, do contact me, email me via Naomi for more questions and sort of unpacking some of the other issues. Now, I just wanted to do that summary before we finish, because I actually, we've got 1 minute. Is that right? We've got 1 minute. That was a very quick summary, and I sort of cut off some of the discussion. But are there other ideas other than the fundamental idea of partnership as a principle of engagement that we need to think about? Chris?
Sorry, I've just wasted a lot of your time then. No, no, look, I think it's, yeah, I think it captures it nicely, really. So yeah. Thank you.
Great. I'm just going to sum up with a couple of things that I think are important to me that have helped my practice over 25 years. Number one is that building trust, and a few of you not only mentioned it, but I felt that you understood the importance of it in your work. So the establishing of trust is key. And also, I think it was Leonie that mentioned something about exploration and not assuming things. So everyone's story is different. I might think, oh, this person's from a refugee community, they've seen trauma. They might not have, okay? But they live in an environment with a family that potentially has come out who has that trauma, and therefore that trauma is intergenerational as well. We see this with our Aboriginal communities. So partnerships, a multifaceted approach, exploration, I like calling exploration, because that involves your research, you're checking your data. Does that match? Like if settlement data, which you can get quite easily, if settlement data says this, local government data says there's a huge South Sudanese population here, we've never engaged with them. So those are, the data aspect is really important, but then building partnerships with those communities is critical to actually implementing anything that is useful. So we're going to finish now, and I just wanted to ask if anyone else had any questions, and I won't be asking you, I won't be pointing at anyone for this, but is there any questions that you have that you'd feel that I didn't really cover and that you'd like more information on, or things that you want us to send to you? I would strongly advise you to go to our website, www.ceh.org.au. We also, so the referral forms and everything for our program will be coming up shortly, but we also house the health translations. And so for people that don't know that, it's the sister site to Better Health Channel, and but you can type in something like AOD and it comes up in many languages. So please don't go out and rush out to do translated materials. It costs money. Hopefully some of that information is already done for you in a plethora of languages. Okay?
And if you don't mind taking just a moment to complete the survey, which is in the chat, a link to the survey is in the chat, and you can pop some of those suggestions about supports or resources that you need in there as well, and we can follow up. So if somebody wants something, everybody can get it.
Yeah. And I guess for me, if this session or other issues that that you encounter sort of raise the need for greater advocacy around this issue and supporting the sector to do this better, this is a really good opportunity to collectively move on some of those ideas and strategies, with VADA as the leader in this area, and we're happy to support ongoing.
And a big thank you to you, Ellie. It was such a huge amount of really helpful information, and yep, you've got some confirmation in the chat there. And you're such an engaging facilitator, such a wise facilitator as well. So please.
Yes, thank you, Ali.
My pleasure.
And thank you for convening.
Yeah, look, there's heaps of chat coming through now. But yeah, thank you so much, Ali, and thanks everyone for your time. Please complete the survey. Please stay in touch. Please let us know what you need. And as Ali said, working in partnership, we'll make sure that we get you the supports that you require to do this work. Super important work.
Great.
Amazing.
Thank you, everybody. Great. Bye.
Bye.